discretion is advised.
I was asked in a thread posted yesterday to share my experience with some exorcisms I witnessed. The following account is entirely true, witnessed firsthand, with no embellishment whatsoever. That said, this is the internet, so I take no offense if you don't believe my account. Here goes. A bit of backstory first to give some context. I am a 24-year-old male born and raised Jamaican, currently attending medical school in Jamaica. I am in my final year, and as a matter of fact, just got home from one of my final exams. I was born with a rare illness that I was not aware of until I was 13, but had suffered severe pain and teasing throughout my childhood as a result. More on that in a bit. My mom and dad were and are very caring and loving parents, but early on in my life, they both had jobs which required them to work late hours. This meant that after school, and some nights would be spent at my mom's mother's house. We are a traditional Indian family, so schoolwork was always first. But after that, I played Super Nintendo and watched Power Rangers until I fell asleep or was picked up by my parents. It was at my grandparents' house, at the tender age of 4, that I had my first paranormal experience. I don't remember much. I just remember seeing a red-eyed shadow, crying my eyes out, and simultaneously and thoroughly pissing my shorts. That opened me up to the paranormal, to where I'm able to sense and see all sorts of spirits, evil and otherwise, plus other gifts. I grew up Christian because of my dad, but my family hardly went to church. Until I was diagnosed at 13, I think I only saw the inside of a church, aside from at my Jesuit-run school 4 times. When I was diagnosed, it was pretty devastating, life-shattering even. Learning you have a painful, debilitating, deforming, degenerative, incurable genetic disease is pretty rough at that age. It was rough for my parents too, more than I probably knew. Shortly after, my family found God again, I suppose looking for answers, and we started going to church, one after another, just checking them out to see which one would fit. Here comes the bit you were waiting for. In early 2004, we found this church in the parish next to ours. I was rough around the edges, but the pastor was a nice guy and the small congregation was welcoming, so we thought, hey, let's give this one a shot. After attending church for a few Sundays, Pastor asked myself and my parents to drop in to see him the upcoming Wednesday. We arrived at Wednesday, not really knowing what to expect, but we were told to come at a precise time. We arrived and the conversation was inconsequential, just him trying to comfort me, asking what I wanted to be, etc. This went on for half an hour before his landline rang. He spoke for about 2 minutes and hung up. This was before cell phones had color screens or even cameras. It took a while to catch on. He told us he had an engagement and we were free to leave. We were kind of puzzled because he went from calm and relaxed to a bit rushed and seemed eager to get us out. My dad pulled him aside and asked what the deal was. He said this was a deliverance deal, where they would attempt exorcisms on people who had been mentally and physically evaluated and found healthy, despite having issues. Apparently he was well known for this and had a high success rate. My dad, being an oddly curious guy, asked if we could watch. Pastor eventually relented and said, yes, but not from where we sit on Sundays. You will stay by the very entrance and leave immediately if I tell you. My mother was rather pissed, but myself, being a horror junkie and having seen The Exorcist maybe 20 times on VHS, and my dad were very interested, but also a bit freaked. Maybe 10 minutes later, this middle-aged black woman walked in, supported by those who I assumed were family and part of the congregation. By supported, I mean physically. For someone who I was told later was 45, she looked haggard, tired, and rather skinny and weak. She looked to be in her late 70s, to be honest. They were all greeted by Pastor, who then guided them to set her down on a chair in the aisle toward the front. I saw Pastor walk towards us and into his office. I heard some rummaging around and saw him come out with 4 black belts. that looked to be the width and thickness of a normal men's belt, but with holes way down. Horrified, I asked, Pastor, where on earth are you going with 4 thick belts? He responded with a slightly surprised or amused look. They're leather, and for restraint, son, to restrain that lady there who has the demon in her. I was now totally captivated, and though, well, that's kind of overkill for a tiny skinny lady, but okay, I'd soon know I was wrong. Pastor asked the lady's consent for the exorcism, and she warily agreed. He and 3 other strong-looking guys proceeded to ask the belts to restrain her hands and legs. He, along with the other 3 men, took out some worn-looking books out of a leather sheath thing, and thus it begun. As soon as she caught sight of the books, the lady began to panic and plead, cry, and beg to be let go, but they did not listen. Pastor then took this little bottle of blessed olive oil from his suit pocket and recited something as he made the sign of the cross on her head. She cried out and tugged at the restraints, but to no avail. At this point, I was very skeptical and disappointed. The 4 then began to read some script from the books, some in English, some in what I suspect was Latin. She was becoming more and more agitated, yanking with all her might at the belts and trying to get up with the chair. Now, I realized the reason the chair was temporarily bolted to the ground. Pastor then reached into his pocket once more and pulled out a small silver flask, poured some of the clear liquid into his hand, and threw it on the lady. This is where he hit the fan. She screamed so loud that I thought my eardrums would burst. Not only that, but there was her voice and a deeper sort of baritone male voice. Angie Arvia saying, "Stop it, you self-right." It was at this point that I noticed that even though she was tugging at the restraints and kind of standing a bit, the chair beneath her was vibrating and moving like crazy without her really touching it. He ignored this and began to recite scripture about the armor of God, to which the woman laughed in that dual falsetto baritone voice. Pastor looked at her sternly and said, "From here on, I'm not speaking to the woman, but the demon inside. Come forth, demon." And then he bopped her on the head with the Bible. Now there was only a deep scream, and then a deep, malicious laugh. "You wanted to see me, sir?" They continued until he got the demon's name. I forget what it was, but it wasn't any of the ones you hear in movies and TV. He called out to it to come out and leave the woman in Jesus' name, but it was fighting and tugging at the restraints. Then the crazy broke loose. He commanded it, and in response, she stood up as much as the restraints would allow and arched her back to some crazy angle. All the while her eyes rolled back and with her mouth fully open and staying open. We heard in the deep voice, "No, she is miney." And suddenly, a brass collection plate that was on the stage flew on its own in their direction, so they had to move to not be hit. At that moment, my eyes went wide, and I thought, "Oh, it's all real, it's all been real. I've seen demons in my own house." Just then, as Pastor was commanding this thing to leave, it snapped a hand restraint and I saw the podium, solid mahogany, burst into pieces like it had been hooked up to C4. The men restrained her until eventually the demon left. I know because I saw it leave the woman and disappear. Not like on Supernatural though, it just kind of diffused with her body and disappeared. So that was my first experience. Voices coming from a fully open mouth, with words being said that you would need jaw and tongue articulation for. A brass collection plate flying across a room on its own, and a solid wood pulpit break into pieces. Think whatever you may like, but as far as I'm concerned, exorcisms, demons, spirits, it's all real. Respect.